All right, well, thank you so much, everybody. It's great to see all of you for this special colloquium. And I am super, super delighted to introduce our speaker, David Shane Lowry, Distinguished Fellow in Native American Studies this year in the History faculty. David is a member of the Lumbee tribe and an MIT alum, class of '07, where he was an anthropology major. And many of us do remember David from those days. In addition to majoring in anthropology, he was also a leader of the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, ACES, and continues to be very active with the Native American Alumni Association, or alumni group at MIT. From MIT, David went on to get his PhD in anthropology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he has taught anthropology at Chicago Medical School and at Biola University in California. His first book, Lumbee Pipelines, is under contract with University of Nebraska Press. A second book, an anthropological portrait of basketball star Michael Jordan, is titled Black Jesus, and I'm sure you're curious about that, and maybe he'll be around all year, so you've got plenty of time to talk to David about that, because today he's going to talk to us about material from the first book, Lumbee Pipelines, and the title of his talk is AI, Artificial Indigeneity, Remattering Native America in an Age of Technological Settling. Thanks, David.
Thank you so much. I'm going to practice the one mass down rule.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I see Jean Jackson is here. She invited me into anthropology years ago, back in like 2005. So credit her with me being here doing this in a lot of ways. But Heather, Stefan, various other faculty, Jim Howe, who's retired, who really encouraged me to take on the conversation that I'm having right now, that I've been having for years now. But I'll start. This talk folds out of a chapter in my upcoming book entitled Lumbee Pipelines, American Indian Movement and the Residue of Settler Society, in which I begin to ask several questions which guide my ethnographic storytelling. So in this chapter, I say there's several questions. How do the conditions of AI meet the conditions of colonialism? How do they touch? In what ways does the interface between human worlds and computer science shed light on AI as a colonial force, or perhaps a medium between colonialism and those who are colonized? How must we begin to look at the work of AI and the narratives about AI as a look into mattering or remattering of American Indians in the first quadrant of the 21st century? So those are some lofty questions, but they kind of help develop my storytelling in that particular chapter. So American Indians are the only ethnic group in the world that must carry a card to be accepted, to be authentic. I recently went to get my employment paperwork at MIT and gave my California ID, which I had, and it was one of those with the star on it, which is interesting symbology, but it allows you to supposedly get on planes without, worry. And then, let's see, and my ID from the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. As the MIT official person looked at it, she was comfortable with the California ID, but she stumbled a bit when she observed the Lumbee card. She said, "I don't think we can take this." I looked, hopefully with a polite tone. I try to be as polite because I'm kind of a big person, and responded, yes, you can. Tribal cards are on the list of official documents. While at first it might seem that a tribal card serves as a way of noting an Indian person's belonging to a tribal nation, in many ways it is proof of existence. Much like a birth certificate or social security card, it is proof that an Indian person, that an American Indian person, that a Native American, that an indigenous person in America is real. As I look at myself as an enrolled entity with a chart number, I'm 7061, and it has my expiration and issue date. So with all these details, right? I'm reminded that this identification document also holds together what is otherwise held in limbo. To get the card, I must show not only that I'm part of the Lumbee community, a process that is being tested always under and is always under debate in the Lumbee community. I must show how I am linked with stacks of genealogy charts. There is no blood requirement, but there seems to still be a requirement that we Lumbee folks are in a community with and biologically related to other Lumbees. However, beyond this card, beyond these relationships of Indian community membership, being American Indian is a constant experiment. Indian folks are concerned with who will accept us, How will we be seen? In a general sense of surviving in a colonial system that rejects us within a rapidly growing economy of identity. This past weekend, our family was introduced to a program called Gizmo that allows family members to securely call a small child through a watch-like device worn on the child's arm. The calling feature is important. However, I was most fascinated by our ability to see a Google Map-like view of the place where the child is located. I began to think about conversations with geographers after Hurricane Matthew who attempted to take the same types of maps and map victims of Hurricane Matthew by social racial category. I would often tell them, the geographers, that GIS technology was unable to replicate indigenous knowledge of water movement within the swamps of North Carolina, which is what they were really interested in. They wanted to say, we use drones to really show you all how your environment works. And I was like, you can't do that. I would often tell them that GIS technology was unable to replicate indigenous knowledge of water movement within the swamps of southeastern North Carolina. I also thought about how these same technologies are used in games like Pokemon Go. Back in 2016, this game which makes real-world places into virtual places through augmented reality technology was a hit and the cause of anxiety because of the ways that it placed children and adults into positions of vulnerability and oppression across race, class, and institutional lines. I began to discuss with colleagues back then how the gamification of geography makes it more and more difficult to assert indigenous patterns and borders as it makes colonialism an experience of instantaneous rewards and constantly negotiated communities. Through AR games at this time, though AR games at this time were marketed as inclusive of all peoples and generators of diversity, they were and continue to be part of a state of perpetual colonial settling. In 2020, the recasting of geography through Pokemon Go was in large part replaced, at least for a moment, by the recasting of geography through political protest. Throughout the year, we saw Americans marching under the flag of Black Lives Matter, facing off against protesters of protecting Confederate statues. And the geography of the United States went from playful renaming by 14-year-olds to the actual renaming by their 18-year-old future selves. Washington, D.C.'s elected officials famously renamed a street in D.C. Black Lives Matter Plaza. I read recently that this actually is becoming an official art installation, like official, through the context of the D.C. government and federal government. I see the same sorts of messages on MIT's campus and around Cambridge. Citizens place placards in their yard or windows, and I saw this the other day, that read Black Lives Matter. But I never see similar placards that read, this is stolen Indian land. Strange. Greg Diehl, indigenous author and critic, spoke at a TED event in Colorado back in 2018. And if you know Greg does really abstract but real Indian art. He stated at the end of this talk, are you making space for indigenous people in your homes and your workspaces? Are you creating inclusion in those spaces? Are you realizing that as you walk these lands, that there are people who walk these lands before you? That these are sacred and important things, and that indigenous people are here and that we matter. And that we will always matter, because this is the land of our inheritance, and this is the land that the Creator gave us, so what are you going to do with this information? Very poignant reminders at the end of his talk. There was a racial synergy, though, and solidarity during the 2020 protest. Americans adjusted to the social justice movement by beginning to use terms like BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I often joke that the I is standing straight up, forced between various groups of non-white peoples that defend their humanities on top of or despite American Indian life. And I don't know if you all remember this. People had fun with this because you have Chiefs Stadium, but you have a message right behind the word Chiefs that says end racism. So definitely some cognitive dissonance and social dissonance. When George Floyd was assassinated in Minneapolis in 2020, the national news media turned toward Minneapolis as riots took place. Demonstrations were held and accountability was demanded by citizens looking at police for humanity. I couldn't help but notice, however, that no one in the news outlets remembered that the neighborhood where Floyd was kneed to death was the site where the American Indian Movement, or AIM, was formed in 1968 as a response to police harassment, oppression, and the murder of American Indians. This is a moment to begin to ask questions about why there seems to be more visibility for certain and marginalized people in the United States as opposed to others. There is copious evidence that American Indians, Native Americans, whatever term you want to use in whatever context, suffer higher rates of violence. CNN actually wrote an article during 2020 that plainly states that American Indians suffer police violence more than any other racial and ethnic group, yet the article wasn't quoted by anybody that was writing about racial justice, or very few people. However, this truth seems to slip to the level of unconsciousness as several binaries, black versus white, immigrant versus citizen, seem to define news media conversations in emerging social justice traditions. American Indians not only remain gravely invisible in the racial politics of American society, the generative force of the American Academy is often choosing to not pay attention to not help create empowerment for the protection of American Indian humanity in the same way it does other ethnic and racial communities. In many ways, this situation is the fault of American anthropology and related disciplines. Anthropologist Lee Baker wrote a book back in the early 2000s, and I actually was sitting in a class at Duke. It was Oren Starnes' class, and Lee came in, and he just talked about the book before he wrote it, titled Anthropology and the Racial Politics of Culture, in which he distinguishes between sociology and anthropology. Baker points out that everything in the main thoroughfares of American life, from colonial projects, where colonial projects are emerging, have been in the way, quote unquote, in the way, and the subjects of sociology. Immigration, the effects of enslavement of African peoples, urban gentrification, have been thoroughly examined by sociologists who aim to address injustices and inequitable power dynamics in contemporary society. On the other hand, Baker suggests that American Indians have long been treated since the beginning of colonization, which is, going back about 500 years or so, as out of the way and the basis for anthropological research. In a recent letter to the anthropology community on the blog Anthrodentum, I took my own things in my own hands in many ways. I followed up on a raging conversation about the renaming of Kroeber Hall at UC Berkeley, in which Nancy Shepherd Hughes blamed, quote unquote, cancel culture for why Kroeber Hall, the site of Berkeley anthropology, was being renamed. I replied in my letter, and I was trying to be super nice but super truthful, right? I replied in my letter that this wasn't cancellation. It was a demand placed on Berkeley for new conversations, and these demands were from American Indian students, policies and funding for American Indian life and humanity. In my efforts to highlight the genius of American Indians, I asserted that, quote, that is what makes the denailing of Kroeber so interesting and important. It is perhaps the first substantial crack in the facade of American anthropology's imprisonment of Native America. From those few removed nails, the Department of Anthropology at Berkeley ought to move into a state of forming an American anthropological model that is governed by the people that Ishii represented. So if you don't know the story of Ishii, he was studied by Kroeber, and his brain was put in museums, and it's a bad story in the eyes of many Native people. Yes, it is time for a new age of American Indian, Native American scholarship that is led by American Indian people and includes permanent faculty positions for American Indians across disciplines. American Indians should no longer be sweeping up dust should no longer be the dust on the floor of anthropological laboratories. However, it took time in this letter to make sure to point out how the uplifting of American Indians into positions of importance cannot take place if consortiums of social justice advocates do not invite American Indian scholars to the proverbial table. These were my words. Quote, a report from the National Center for Education Statistics states that American Indian numbers in the academy were so low in 2018, significantly less than 1% of all tenurable faculty, that our numbers couldn't be broken into sex or gender, which is interesting. If you look at reports commissioned by the American Anthropological Association to study race in our discipline, there is no sign that American Indian anthropologists have any real presence in the discipline. A 2010 report mildly references American Indian experiences in anthropology, but the committee that issued the report consisted of zero American Indian faculty. Most of its members are scholars of black racial experiences. American Indians remain odd visuals within the academic marketplace, unable to occupy faculty offices like our non-Indian colleagues, unquote. This absence and or silence of American Indians in anthropology has bled into other disciplines. An excellent example is political science, where conversations about rights to vote and voter integrity were increasingly focused around questioning the political quote-unquote system, without realizing that the American political system is built against American Indians. A prime example of this was when CNN, during the 2020 elections, labeled American Indians as something else. Is there anybody that has not seen this graph? So literally during the campaign, this was plopped up on the screen, and Indians on Twitter and everywhere else were like, "Are you ishing me? Seriously? We're something else." Okay. Would this have happened if the MIT Poli-Sci department had American Indian faculty is my question. The politics of Indian erasure has entered the realm of scholarly funding. Over the last few years, I've noticed that the American Indian awardees of the MacArthur Genius Grants are usually artists, performers, or agents of activities that non-Indians see as stereotypically American Indian. Despite the many American Indian scientists, social critics, and indigenous trendsetters across the United States, American Indians remain sources of entertainment and tokenism. This year, in 2021, the MacArthur Foundation simply did not choose American Indians. There were several Black, Latino, white geniuses. There was an Asian genius. I think there was a genius that was blind. He was an American Indian. It seems like American Indian intelligence is erased via mandates within American philanthropy that opposes intellectual growth and presence. This is in the shadow of a federal government infrastructure that proudly displays its founding intellectual document, the Declaration of Independence, which describes American Indians as merciless Indian savages. This is still like a document that runs our country, or guides it. And in the shadow of a widespread bigoted use of American Indian stickers on school lockers, which I just saw lockers walking in the hallway here, and T-shirts worn by teachers, principals, and others trusted community leaders. I know my wife's sister told me stories of how one of the teachers that was opposing Indian education in her home community would wear Redskins masks to school, sort of on purpose. But that's what we have to deal with as Indian folks. Then we have this. These are employees of the Center for Disease Control. How do we make sense of employees at the CDC meeting at the stadium of the Atlanta baseball team? What does it mean when public health in the United States wears Indian caricatures? It seems like fields of play and work are positioned to metaphysically and psychologically emerge out of and despite indigenous ruins, genocide, and absence. The Academy, and I'll return to the Academy. The Academy is a prime place for a conversation about the intersections of work and play. Universities like the University of Illinois and the University of Oklahoma are funded by eager donors and governments that see the student athletic sphere as one in which the contemporary world is still emerging out of a long-past indigenous world. Archaeology is a core discipline at these universities. Faculty around the nation joke that universities often use archaeology on the university homepages to show the living out of liberal education, even though students find their own ways, not necessarily archaeology, to mine the academic world. So literally on their front pages, they just show you archaeologists, even though the student will probably not take archaeology classes. This union between archaeology and the Geist, or the spirit, of American academic life has been evident here at MIT. In the early 1990s, there was a falling out between MIT Anthropology and a consortium of anthropologists when a closing was proposed for the Center for Materials Research in Archaeology and Ethnology. A 1994 article from MIT News stated that Professor Heather Leckman protested the provost's vision to close the center and published a 28-page booklet titled An Institute in Ruins, which set out her criticism. I don't want to get into a discussion of why the center exists now, was closing then, or still exists. Some questions that my students actually are investigating this year in our course, Indigenous History of MIT. But I have become highly interested in the framework that Leckman evoked back then in the article from MIT News, one in which she envisioned a university that was properly structured and without fault, which in her mind became ruined at some point. Indeed, I will assert here that what Leckman was witnessing was not an institute in ruins. It was an institute that created, studied, and was funded by ruins. Indeed, the capital for Leckman Center, a center which has studied human remains, some of which might have been American Indian, we're not sure yet. We're trying to figure that out with Peabody, came from a larger pot of institutional money that was seeded by profits from the engineering and managing of stolen American Indian land through the permission of the Morrill Acts of 1862, 1890, and subsequent years. On top of that, MIT's early leaders, especially Francis Walker, MIT's third president, gained their professional standing to become leaders in technology education through participation in the massacre and elimination of indigenous peoples throughout the United States. What I believe is probably the most important legacy of Francis Walker at MIT, whether MIT changes the name of Walker Memorial or not, which I heard they don't even officially reference Walker Memorial, they call it its building number, is the fact that he provided permission for MIT to be the center of pilfering, of rummaging American Indian land and bodies for centuries after him. Just a bit earlier, I discussed the tension around the Center for Materials Science, Materials Research in Archaeology and Ethnology. It has been strongly associated with Harvard University and the Peabody Museum, which is in a moment of contemplation. I don't know if you've read the article from the Harvard, Gazette, about what it should do with the hundreds of American Indian skeletons that still exist in Peabody's building, which this is Peabody. Pilfering also defines what is happening in the biosciences at MIT. A faculty member associated with Broad Institute, David Reich, has faced criticism of his attempts to explain race and genetics. Ian Holmes in The Atlantic discussed Reich's inept attempts to define the relationship between race, genetics, and identity. While Reich attempts to say that race is a social construct, which is true, he uses it to help make sense of his genetic sequencing and to connect people today to people thousands of years ago. This is not only dangerous, but also a breeding ground for eugenics policies and racial supremacist thinking that will eventually affect policy. One of Reich's projects, which attempts, as I understand, to figure out where American Indians, where I and my community come from, swallows up genetic material from indigenous populations from the far northern part of North America all the way to the tip of South America. I've long thought about the ethics of genetic research, especially genetic research that aims to define, to authenticate American Indian community and identity. Kim Tallbear, an alum of MIT, has written extensively about this in her book, Native American DNA. However, I want to take a moment to push MIT to consider the absence of indigenous presence within institutional processes that vet and validate research that is either centered within or directly impacts indigenous people, whether as individuals or as tribal communities. I met recently with administrators from Kuhase. I have been here only a few weeks, and I've met with hundreds of people, it feels like, which is MIT's IRB board. It's called Kuhase. And I asked them who at MIT was affiliated with Kuhase, who would be at least partially responsible for assessing the ethics of this type of research, Reich's, for example, in relationship to indigenous populations. Just curious, just want to ask some questions. The administrators quickly told me that in Reich's case, use of genetic material is often used in such a way that is not identified and it makes it outside the scopes of Kuhase. I rebutted. I hope I had a nice look on my face. I mean, I was trying to be as nice as I could. I rebutted, but it is identified enough to qualify a certain people group, a certain tribe. So I was saying to them, you can use the material even though it doesn't identify certain people to actually define entire tribal populations. The administrators then told me that there were no constituencies on Kuhase. They got into this conversation about who belongs on Kuhase. That it was in fact colorblind and otherwise blind to political identities. They told me additionally that they remembered no research over the last 20 years that came through Kuhase that dealt directly with indigenous peoples. They also stated that there was no way for them to search their databases for indigenous presence because their software doesn't allow for it. So I was left in a proverbial, as we say, pickle. If genetic research does not identify American Indian people and is sent through an IRB panel with no American Indian people, or indigenous people, and is searched for in a database that does not have intelligence to see American Indian people, American Indian people seem entirely eradicated from the whole scientific process, even though we're probably there. This leads into a needed but difficult conversation of the multiple levels within which indigenous peoples must be remattered in states of technological settling. Not only, as I pointed out in Krober's letter, must American Indians go from research subject to valued voice within the academy with a sense of urgency. We have to be urgent about this. there must be some accounting that happens that attempts to restore centuries of erasure of American Indians in science and technology work. As we are building technologically savvy and scientifically informed worlds, we must build them with indigenous sovereignties at the center, asking questions and having conversations that would otherwise not happen or that aren't happening now. Why do I ask for a sense of urgency? Technology has long been used to war against and oppress vulnerable communities, but it was relatively slow 100 years ago, even 75 years ago. From guns to germs, colonization before the 20th century was based on slow technology. However, the current age of technological progress is creating a much more intense need to make the relevancy of technology more obvious much more quickly. From internet lines laid under the ocean by Google, which happened literally, I think, days or weeks ago, to global genomic databases, to transnational, transcorporate projects to colonize various places outside of the earth. Every square inch of the Western Hemisphere, even as the Western Hemisphere moves up above the earth, which has already stolen indigenous land, is under a new technological eminent domain which aims to enhance visibility, e.g. of the biological self, alongside increased promises of personal protection, e.g. from hackers and digital exchanges. We're living in second lives, to borrow from the language from Tom Bolstroff, anthropologist, and increasingly virtual realities that are not coded to make up for absences and racial political marginalization in real life. This work to indigenize science and technology thus must take into account what I consider to be a crisis of Cartesian dualism. Cartesian dualism, in case you've never heard the term, is a framing of humans as both mind and body. It assumes that our minds and bodies exist at some point in some way together and uniform. However, what troubles this assumption is that colonial processes simultaneously disintegrate the body and mind of indigenous people, and I would argue non-indigenous people too. Our minds have been fragmented through policies that seem to live out Colonel Richard Pratt's proclamation in the 1800s that boarding schools for American Indians worked because they killed the Indian. That means their mind and identity, but saved the man. And I think, no, I didn't have a photo of him. At the same time, Indian bodies continue to be killed through policies in governments, universities, and corporations that attempt to malnourish Indian peoples and expose us to cancerous toxins. I wrote about this years ago in a blog post in which I advocated for the Anthropocene to be called the Eugenocene. Corporations, usually led by white men and women, are at the helm of planetary destruction, period. Indigenous people, in the wake of this catastrophic work, continue to be victims of eugenics policies. This is what makes sites of AI creation and policy extremely critical. Recent conversations about artificial intelligence have been about if and why artificial intelligence needs a body. Okay, so we're still dealing with that Cartesian dualism. Computer scientist Mark Lee wrote back in October of 2020 in an argument about why artificial intelligence must be embodied that, quote, "It is clear that all this social interaction only makes sense to the parties involved if they have a sense of self," and that was in quotation marks, and can similarly maintain a model of the self of the other agent. In order to understand someone else, it is necessary to know oneself. An AI self-model, again in quotations, should include a subject perspective involving how its body operates. For example, its visual viewpoint depends upon the physical location of its eyes, a detailed map of its own space, and a repertoire of well-understood skills and actions, unquote. What Lee alludes to is the idea that the reality of being in the world, the problem of experiencing the atmosphere and environment and then reacting to it, can only happen through an anatomical scaffolding. What he also alludes to, perhaps more importantly, is that the mind working inside the body is affected by senses of ownership. And that's where we get the quotation, own space, within which it lives in communion or community with like-minded beings. Non-indigenous debates about what makes AI more or less human do not, however, take into account landscapes within which AI is created, which are also states of perpetual removal and silencing of indigenous bodies, minds, of indigenous ways of knowing and seeing and speaking, and of indigenous leadership. They do not take into account what distinguishes racial erasure of American Indians from the racial erasure of other people groups. The fact that American Indians are rarely present anatomically or intellectually. So, to speak of Native American presence in artificially intelligent worlds is to face their erasure and attempt to correct it in the midst of rampant technological settling. I credit Joy Balawini, which I've never said her name, I've only typed it out, Joy Balawini, who just defended her dissertation, I heard, in the MIT Media Lab, who began opening up a conversation about the inadequacies of computer programming when she revealed through her research that computer programming created artificially intelligent moments of reading in which white faces were privileged, if not solely identified. In 2019, stories about her work were everywhere, and for good reason. Race was both a revealing and occlusive reality, and she brilliantly exposed that. Her work, which is centered around a project or organization entitled Algorithmic Justice League, has continued into the present. Most recently, she has prodded companies like Olay, which makes skincare and makeup products, to fight bias, quote unquote, in beauty algorithms. This is just one example of increasingly important work centered around what Forbes magazine called taking the magic out of AI. Already established social distinctions and prejudices, policies of exclusion, are focused on and potentially eliminated from coding work, or that's the ideal. However, I perceive that the problems of artificial intelligence are much worse when we begin to consider the intellectual foundations that have spawned not just inequities in computer programming, but entire ecosystems of disappearance, within which virtual and other AI realities are created and live. It is one conversation to detect differences in how people who are seen are treated. It is another conversation to begin to address how technological worlds, especially those based on recognition, affect and are affected by people who have been erased from fields of recognition. So I asked in this moment, what do we do when we have hashtags such as missing and murdered indigenous women, and the people who are supposed to investigate those murders have no relationship with indigenous people in the United States, and their consciousness is not built around those communities, and sort of statistically we're realizing that, wait, at least unofficially, these people are going missing. How does AI, how does the technological world kind of interface with that murderous reality? At this point, I would like to discuss what this means in the context of my fieldwork in the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. Since 2009, I have remained interested in the ways that a deep history of medical eugenics in the United States, which has long been created and reinforced to target particular racial and ethnic communities, has been transformed in the age of electronic medical records and emergency rooms filled with hardware into an incessant inability to see American Indians in the clinical space. A little while back, I retweeted an article written by Professor Amy Moran. Is Amy here? Oh, hey, how you doing? I've retweeted some of your stuff. In the Department of Anthropology here at MIT about the racial conditions of pulse ox, a device used to measure the concentration of oxygen in the blood of humans through a device usually placed at the fingertip. I suggested that an argument about race situated around skin color doesn't recognize how racial mistakes take place in anatomical contexts within which race is not visible, in which the conditions of medical misdiagnosis is a matter of clinical tools that have been crafted in the aftermath of indigenous genocide. If a pulse ox reads through a darker pigmented American Indian person different than it reads through a lighter pigmented American Indian person, it will take something else, some other clinical relationship and expertise to know that both patients were American Indian. The power of the history of American eugenics is that it has placed indigenous anatomical realities so far outside what Foucault calls the clinical gaze, that American Indian care requires new clinical assemblages that indigenize healthcare, that humanize American Indians in the absence of Indian presences in medical education. In the Lumbee community, holistic healthcare that addresses what healthcare experts label social determinants of health requires that patients utilize a range of healthcare systems and communities in North Carolina and across state lines. When the COVID pandemic hit the U.S. and various agencies began to read statistics of COVID in the Lumbee community, They provided percentages of Lumbee people who had COVID and who subsequently were vaccinated. My first reaction at this, and my wife Nicole is here, and we talked about it and debated this all the time. My first reaction at that time was that there was no way for them to know the numbers. No way. Since Lumbees naturally within the current colonial medical state travel across various borders into various institutions to be treated. They're present but not present. They're counted but not counted. This medical missing of Lumbee people has helped define what I call the age of life insurance in the Lumbee community. During the pandemic, I heard an insurance agent describe how Lumbee people, and this was actually at a meeting about pipelines, which was interesting. I heard an insurance agent describe how Lumbee people became a larger customer base for life insurance companies who push against the increased use of algorithmic underwriting in the insurance industry. One insurance agent, with a sense of liberty knowing that he was doing well, he was making well over 6 figures as a high school graduate, supposedly. I don't know that for a fact, told me that insurance companies could make a lot of money if they sell insurance to people in large groups of sickness in communities where community members help other community members prepare to die, and often early. This agent told me, quote, "We have this thing that we do. We aren't looking for the healthiest to insure, we're looking for the sickest." It's funny, isn't it? What he was describing was one facet of a biomedical world in southeastern North Carolina in which countless medical organizations were attempting to monetize colonial and racial oppression, the erasure of American Indians through eugenics. Within a public health world that has no longer focused, or that was no longer focused on creating healthy environments for entire communities, but in treating Lumbee community members as individuals whose health would be treated in isolation. One nurse told me this past year that many Lumbee patients aren't even identified as Indian anymore. I said, okay. They often go as other in medical records, which are then circulated within healthcare algorithmic programs that help medical forecasters and healthcare corporations see certain trends back in the community, e.g. upticks in cancer, and then respond to them. This has paralleled seemingly random conversations that Nicole, my wife, and I have had with community members. An employee of the DMV told us that many American Indian people were either mislabeled or non-labeled in the DMV system, so the Department of Motor Vehicles. I have to explain to them, one of the DMV workers said, that race on these cards means something when you go into a hospital. They may put you down as black. You aren't black. They may say you're nothing, but you're something. You're Indian. She smiled. They usually agree with me. While the movement of Indian people into artificially intelligent healthcare worlds is critical to understand and address, what I also have discovered is that health and wellness of American Indians in North Carolina is surrounded and inundated by artificially intelligent corporate practices that design the layout of corporate animal feed operations, which are called CAFOs, in North Carolina. An interesting article from 2019 in the journal Nature Sustainability described how organizations like the Pew Charitable Trust and Waterkeeper Alliance, which I've helped advise in North Carolina for a year or so, have been interested in how CAFOs are regulated. As a result, an emerging network of conversations are taking place about how deep learning, which is associated with AI, can help take satellite or drone images of CAFO locations and turn them into efforts to limit the presence of CAFOs in vulnerable human communities. What I find interesting in this moment is that scientists, whether they are academic, humanitarian, or described in some other way, are simply inviting Lumbee people to become part of the advocacy efforts based on these new GIS technologies. Without critical conversations on the ground that place indigenous community leaders in the middle. You might be surprised, I told one waterkeeper last year, when these Lumbee farmers really care that your deep learning, quote unquote, is affecting their deep pockets. Not only had Lumbee people become individualized within the AI-enriched business of healthcare, they were choosing to, as capitalists, you might say, push against the ways that AI-enriched advocacy was taking away the CAFOs as an opportunity to build wealth. It is at this moment, as I conclude this conversation, that I want to present my vision for an indigenous technological future. A technological future that is artificially indigenous. Technological processes, programs, and innovations are often not in line with American Indian and Native American ways of being, because first and foremost, they have not been created for us, by us, with us. On the other hand, I think a push to make artificially indigenous realities part of new schools and epistemologies is prime time to see not only how these realities continue to marginalize American Indian people, which we had a great conversation about this last night on Indigenous Peoples Day. I brought students online and we just chatted about this. But also how you, academic stakeholders, can open up the AI-centric academic space to indigenous folks in ways that attempt to humanize us, in ways that want us and our complications to be ever present in academic conversations. It is time, to be honest, to make citizen science a new buzzword in the academic world and to science citizenship. It is time for science and technology to show us its Indian card, to prove that it is about Indian peoples, indigenous peoples, to be centered in indigenous communities. In a world of drones that fly over indigenous terrains, non-indigenous folks must purposely approach indigenous folks, human to human, and have relationships. This is the beginning of a conversation that I call artificial indigeneity. Thank you. And this photo was actually taken, it's one of many photos in the Washington Post. It's an article, and do you remember the name of it? It was called, like, How Do You Know Someone's Indian? And so Lumbees, it was all Lumbee people. We were all taking, not me and not us, but they took photos, and the Washington Post just put all their photos in the article. So I think it's interesting because it's a skin conversation, it's a kind of phenotypic conversation, but it's also a conversation about why we're even here teaching. So thank you.